He's known as the greatest cave diver who ever existed. Let me tell you about a guy who was stuck in a cave for 17 days. Nations rallied and the nations prayed for his safety. Men came together and they had to dig him out of the ground, literally. Did he eventually make it out of a 50-feet cave collapse? Stick around, because this is a thrilling story and you'd want to find out if he eventually made it out alive. So grab a sheet, you might need something to squeeze during the story. Let the question linger. Would he make it out alive? Floyd Collins entered the sand cave in Kentucky on January 30th, 1925, carrying a kerosene lantern. The cave opening was narrow, forcing him to crawl on his knees over sharp-pointed stones. Step by step, he moved deeper into the dark, guided only by the dim light from his lantern. He reached a section called the turnaround room, a place he had named because of how dangerous it was. Beyond this point, the path narrowed to a 9-inch opening, small enough to compare to a soda bottle. This tight passage was known as the squeeze. Floyd pressed forward, his body scraped against sharp crystals, tearing at his clothes as he used his feet to push himself through the narrow hole. Slowly, he reached a wider section of the cave with a ledge. Here, he tied a rope to a rock and carefully descended 10 feet into a deeper chamber. This was where the cave ended, but Floyd had a goal. He had been working to open a passage to a hidden crystal chamber. This place, filled with pristine white gypsum crystals, had been his project for months. He chipped away at the rocks, slowly uncovering a new, beautiful part of the cave no one had seen before. After finishing his work for the day, Floyd began the long journey back. The path was so tight he had to drag himself forward. His hands were useless in the narrow space. As he crawled, his lantern began to dim. Then, it slipped from his grasp, falling and shattering on the ground. The cave plunged into complete darkness. Floyd, now alone, continued to crawl, relying on memory and touch. But as he moved, disaster struck. His foot knocked loose a large stone, which fell and pinned his ankle. He was trapped. Floyd tried to free himself, using his other foot to push the stone, but the space was too tight. The heavy rock wouldn't budge. Small stones started to fall around him, making his position even worse. He was wedged in the narrow passage, with sharp rocks pressing into his back and freezing water dripping onto his face. Every attempt to move only made things worse. Floyd was stuck, 60 feet below the surface, with no way to escape. Realizing he couldn't free himself, Floyd did the only thing he could. He screamed for help. His voice echoed through the cave, but no one responded. Hours passed, and Floyd's shouts grew weaker. Exhausted, he eventually fell asleep. When he woke, he began screaming again, but the dark cave swallowed his cries. A whole day passed, and still no one came. Meanwhile, Floyd's passion for exploring caves had shaped much of his life. Born on June 20th, 1887, in Logan County, Kentucky, he started caving when he was just 6 years old. He would spend hours in the caves near his home, sometimes even sleeping in them. Over time, his love for exploration led him to discover new caves. In 1917, he found one on his father's farmland. It was his first big discovery, but he didn't stop there. Floyd became involved in what people called the Kentucky Cave Wars. This was a time when landowners competed to attract tourists to their caves. Mammoth Cave, the largest cave system in the world, was the main attraction in the area, but smaller caves like Floyd's tried to draw visitors too. In Cave City, a nearby town surrounded by thousands of caves, tourism was the main source of income. But with so many caves and few visitors, competition was fierce. Floyd's first cave didn't attract much attention. It wasn't unique enough to stand out. Determined to succeed, Floyd partnered with a landowner to explore a new cave, the Sand Cave. They agreed to split any profits, and Floyd began working on making the cave accessible. The location was ideal, just a short distance from the highway. What made this cave special was its gypsum crystal chamber, a beautiful and rare feature. But reaching it was difficult, and Floyd spent months clearing a path. On the day he got trapped, Floyd had finally reached the crystal chamber. It was a moment of triumph for him. The white crystals sparkled, and he spent hours admiring the hidden beauty he had uncovered. He was proud, knowing he was the first person to ever see this place. But as he began his journey back, the cave's dangers caught up with him. Stuck under the heavy rock, Floyd shouted into the darkness for nearly 23 hours. Finally, his luck changed. Two men, Ed Estes and Dee Boyle, came to the cave entrance. With them was Boyle's son, Jewel. They heard faint cries for help and realized someone was trapped inside. Homer saw Floyd's coat and cap hanging outside the cave. That was enough to tell him Floyd was inside. He entered the cave calling for Floyd, but got no response. Determined, he went deeper into the dark cave, past the turnaround section, where he found the squeeze hole. He shouted again. This time, Floyd's voice came faintly from the other side. The cave's entrance was near a highway, so a crowd had already gathered outside. Homer was Floyd Collins's younger brother, and now he was desperate to save him. Before this, Floyd had asked Homer to join him in exploring the cave, but Homer had declined. Now, filled with regret, he pushed forward through the narrow, rough passage. The sharp rocks scratched him, but he ignored the pain. When Homer finally reached Floyd, he could barely touch his brother's face with his feet. The scene was grim. Floyd was trapped, trapped, with his ankle pinned under a massive rock and a mound of smaller stones piled over him, threatening to collapse further. Homer assessed the situation. There were only two ways to get close. He could go feet first, but then he wouldn't be able to help Floyd. If he went head first, he could reach Floyd, but would have to lift more than 100 kilograms of rock upside down in an incredibly tight space. It was almost impossible. Floyd, shivering in the cold, needed food and warmth. Homer handed him sandwiches and coffee, which helped a little. Floyd spoke weakly about seeing the crystal chamber, then vowed never to return to the cave if he ever got out alive. Homer took those words to heart and got to work. For the next 8 hours, Homer worked tirelessly in an upside-down position, scraping away at the rocks using a small can. But as he removed rocks, more fell from above, undoing his progress. The cramped space was suffocating. Exhausted and frustrated, Homer was forced to crawl back out of the cave. When he emerged, he was shocked to see over 100 people gathered outside. They were talking loudly and making absurd suggestions about how to save Floyd. Reporters swarmed Homer, demanding details about his brother's ordeal. He had no patience for them. All he wanted was help, not interviews. One persistent reporter, William Miller, tried to approach Homer. Annoyed, Homer snapped at him, challenging him to go inside the cave if he wanted more information. To Homer's surprise, Miller accepted the challenge. Armed with a kerosene lantern, Miller entered the cave. He waded through shallow water on the floor and reached the turnaround section. The sight of the 9-inch squeeze hole terrified him, but he pressed on. Squeezing through the sharp, narrow space, he eventually reached Floyd. Miller tried to interview Floyd, but it was no use. Floyd was too weak and barely responsive, lying in freezing water. Realizing he couldn't help, Miller crawled back out. Homer was relieved to see him return safely. At least Miller had the courage to try, unlike the rest of the crowd. Now, there were two people committed to rescuing Floyd. Miller's detailed articles about Floyd's plight spread like wildfire. Newspapers and radios across America covered the story, and soon the entire nation was captivated. People everywhere asked the same question: when will Floyd Collins be saved? The pressure mounted as another person entered the story, Robert Burden. He was the third person to pass the squeeze hole and reach Floyd. Burden had a bold plan: tie Floyd with a rope and pull him out. Floyd was barely conscious, his eyes fluttering open and shut. Burden placed him in a belt jacket, gave him some coffee and food, and administered a pain relief tablet to ease his suffering. With Floyd secured, Burden, Homer, and Miller prepared for a tug-of-war with the cave. 3 more men joined them, making it 6 in total, all pulling the rope with everything they had. The cave, however, was not willing to let Floyd go. As they pulled, Floyd screamed in agony. His body was being crushed against the ceiling, and he begged them to stop. His cries were heart-wrenching. Despite their combined strength, the effort failed. Floyd remained trapped, and the team was forced to stop before they caused him even more pain. Exhausted and defeated, Miller left to report on the situation back in the city. His detailed accounts continued to make headlines, turning Floyd's ordeal into a national sensation. When Miller returned to the cave, he noticed someone had placed a light bulb inside. He carefully tied one to Floyd's collar, hoping the warmth would provide some comfort. He told Floyd that thousands of people across the country were praying for him. Floyd, trapped for almost 100 hours by this point, managed to share a message through the newspapers. He expressed his belief that he would be rescued alive and thanked those who were trying to save him. Despite his dire circumstances, Floyd held on to hope. The story had touched hearts nationwide. The President of the United States, Calvin Coolidge, had also become interested in the situation. This event had grown to become the 3rd largest non-political gathering between World War I and World War II. The crowd outside the cave swelled dramatically, from 1,000 people to an overwhelming 10,000. Hotels in the area quickly became fully booked, and local restaurants struggled to keep up with the demand for food. The scene outside was chaotic, with more and more people arriving. Local residents seized the opportunity to make some money. They began charging visitors $10 to camp on their land. Some even went as far as renting out bathtubs as makeshift beds for those desperate enough to pay for a place to sleep. Over 4,500 vehicles were parked within a 1-mile radius of the cave. The spectacle drew the attention of Carmichael, the superintendent of the Kentucky Rock Association, who arrived with government officials, rescue teams, and military personnel to help Floyd. Carmichael wasn't pleased with Homer's attempts at rescuing Floyd and decided to take control. The first thing he did was order a full survey of the cave. The survey revealed a worrying issue. The sheer number of people outside was causing vibrations that threatened the stability of the cave. Small loose rocks had already begun to fall inside, creating a dangerous situation. One member of Carmichael's team, Casey Jones, ventured into the cave. He managed to squeeze through the narrow section and reached Floyd, who was weak and screaming for help. But as Casey got closer, the cave's ceiling started crumbling faster. Floyd, thirsty and desperate, seemed to want water. Casey gave him coffee, but Floyd refused to drink it, turning his head away. At that moment, Casey realized Floyd wasn't just thirsty, Casey, he had given up hope. Trapped for 5 days, Floyd seemed to accept his fate. He no longer wanted to survive alone. He wanted someone to stay with him. Casey, understanding the danger, decided to retreat immediately. Rocks were falling all around him as he scrambled back through the narrow passage. Miraculously, he made it out just as the cave collapsed behind him, sealing Floyd's route entirely. With the path to Floyd completely blocked, there were now only 2 options. The first was to abandon the rescue effort entirely. The second was to dig a new tunnel from above, straight down to Floyd's location. The decision was made to dig. The operation was massive, with Carmichael bringing in high-tech machinery and professional workers from the city. The mission became an organized, large-scale effort. Carmichael, a seasoned expert, calculated the requirements. To dig 55 feet down, a crew of 75 people worked in shifts. They aimed to dig 2 feet per hour, estimating that the task would take about 30 hours. But time was their enemy. Floyd's survival depended on whether he could last that long. The workers labored at full speed, and replacements were always ready to step in to keep the digging constant. Outside the cave, the scene had transformed into a bizarre carnival. There were Ferris wheels, food stalls, families having picnics, and church groups singing hymns. Bootleggers sold liquor, and some even smuggled drugs. There was even a juggler entertaining the crowd by tossing colorful balls into the air. It was like a chaotic, surreal fairground. However, rumors about Floyd's situation started spreading. People began questioning why he hadn't been rescued yet. Some believed he didn't want to be saved, while others accused the rescue mission of being a publicity stunt. Wild theories circulated, including claims that Floyd wasn't trapped at all, or that he had been murdered in the cave. These rumors became so outlandish that they began to overshadow the rescue efforts. Groups of troublemakers took things further, playing cruel pranks. A group of 3 went to a telegraph office, pretending to be Floyd. They sent a message to Floyd's mother, who had already passed away years earlier, claiming he was alive and would soon come home. Such antics only added to the chaos and frustration surrounding the rescue mission. Meanwhile, the workers faced increasing challenges. Despite their best efforts, their digging speed slowed. At one point, they managed only 4 inches per hour. Adding to the tension was the uncertainty about Floyd's condition. A light bulb had been placed near him to provide warmth, powered by a simple copper wire. An engineer connected the wire to a radio amplifier, which detected fluctuations caused by Floyd's breathing. As long as the wire moved, it meant Floyd was still alive. This device became the sole source of hope for the rescuers. Initially, they had estimated the tunnel would take 30 hours to complete, but after 144 hours of non-stop digging, they had only reached 44 feet. To make matters worse, it began to rain. The downpour turned into a storm, threatening to collapse the newly dug tunnel. The rescue mission dragged on for 15 days. Floyd had now been trapped for over 2 weeks. Public interest began to wane, and the massive crowds outside the cave slowly dispersed. Newspapers stopped covering the story, and the fairground atmosphere faded. Only a handful of determined individuals remained, holding on to hope. Then, the worst happened. The light bulb that had been keeping Floyd warm stopped working. With it, the radio amplifier could no longer detect any signs of breathing. On February 16th, at 1:30 p.m., the workers finally broke through to Floyd's location after digging 55 feet. But after 17 days trapped in the cold, dark cave, it was unlikely that anyone could survive such harsh conditions. 12 days passed without food or water. The light bulb that had kept Floyd warm had burned out. When Homer lit the torch to check on Floyd, he saw him sitting there. His mouth was slightly open, and a golden tooth shimmered faintly in the dim light. But Floyd was already gone. The crowd outside grew silent as they were informed that Floyd Collins was no more. Reports suggested he had died 3 days earlier, the day the light bulb went out. It seemed he had only survived a day beyond that point. Efforts to rescue Floyd had been delayed, and the sand cave was too unstable to risk removing his body. So, the authorities sealed the cave, leaving Floyd entombed. The next day, Floyd's family held a funeral at their home. However, not many visitors came at first. But the story of Floyd Collins didn't end there. It became even more bizarre. The owner of the sand cave, a man named Doyle, decided to turn tragedy into profit. He placed a sign outside that read something like, "Come see the famous cave for just 50 cents. Yes, he turned Floyd's grave into a tourist attraction. Meanwhile, the workers who had risked their lives digging to save Floyd received no compensation and had to leave empty-handed. This was also the era when William Miller won a Pulitzer Prize for reporting on the story, while Homer Collins, Floyd's brother, began raising money to retrieve Floyd's body. Months passed, and Homer finally raised enough funds. On April 17, 1927, he and his team began digging again. It took them a week to free Floyd. They removed the rock that had trapped his ankle and brought him back to the surface. Floyd was temporarily buried next to his mother, and for a while it seemed like his story had finally come to an end. But fate had other plans. 2 years later, the Collins family faced financial difficulties. A dentist named Harry B. Thomas approached them with a tempting offer. He promised $10,000 for the land where the sand cave was located. Homer was against selling it, but his father, Lee Collins, who struggled with alcoholism, gave in to the lure of money and sold the property. However, the deal included an agreement that everything on the land now belonged to Thomas. This included Floyd's body. Thomas wasted no time capitalizing on this grim opportunity. He had Floyd's body exhumed and placed it in a glass coffin, turning it into a macabre display. He showcased Floyd's remains in the cave itself, using them to attract visitors. Floyd Collins became more famous in death than he had ever been in life. His body, now a spectacle, drew crowds from far and wide. In short, Floyd's body had become the centerpiece of a profitable tourist attraction. The Collins family was devastated. They filed a case against Thomas, but since the agreement was legally binding, Thomas won. For 2 years, visitors flocked to see the body of Floyd Collins, making Thomas's failing cave business a success. But on March 19, 1929, something unexpected happened. 2 people broke into the cave and stole Floyd's body. It was later found abandoned in a forest, but his feet were missing. To this day, no one knows who took them or why. There were theories, of course. Some believed the theft was the work of competitors in the caving business, who might have displayed the feet elsewhere to attract their own visitors. Others suspected the Collins family themselves, but there was no evidence to support any of these claims. Regardless, poor Floyd, who had only wanted to explore caves, had become an unwilling centerpiece in a bizarre saga. Even after his death, his body remained a tourist attraction. To prevent further incidents, Floyd's remains were placed in a metal box, secured with chains, and locked. It seemed like Floyd, who had been trapped in life, was now trapped in death. Decades later, in 1989, the Mammoth Cave National Park acquired the property. The cave was permanently sealed, and a steel gate was installed at the entrance. Finally, after years of controversy, Floyd's body was removed and buried at the Baptist Church Cemetery. 64 years after his tragic death, Floyd Collins was finally at peace. The irony of Floyd's story was not lost on anyone. He had spent months carving out the sand cave with his own hands, only to have it become his grave. His life and death became a cautionary tale, a grim reminder of how ambition can sometimes lead to unexpected tragedy. Years later, a similar incident occurred. John Edward Jones, a young man exploring a cave as a joke, became trapped upside down for 27 hours before dying in Nutty Putty Cave. His body, like Floyd's, remains sealed inside, and the cave is closed forever. These stories remind us of the dangers of exploration and the fine line between bravery and tragedy. The legacy of Floyd Collins continues to captivate people even today. He is remembered as one of the greatest cave explorers of all time, and with that, the tale of Floyd Collins comes to an end.